This is GeekGab with your host, Dornall and me, Daddy Warpig. We are back. GeekGab for Saturday, November 10th, 2018. We have got a great show planned for you. We have a special guest in the house, a game designer who worked on the famous and infamous Halo franchise way back at the dawn of time on Halo 1 and on Halo 2, worked in fact on the multiplayer components of the game, which is, of course, one of the huge reasons why Halo was a big seller. We are going to get to discuss that this week. And so hosting duties today have been turned over to Dornall. So, which is why you can see my logo if you're watching this on YouTube and not the channel. So let me throw this to Dornall, man. What's up?
Hey, how's it going, man?
Busy. I've been doing a lot of research this week, a lot of skull sweat, a lot of theorizing, answering a lot of fundamental questions about certain things, and then also building some game mechanics and stuff. So it's been a busy week.
Yikes. I wish I could say the same for me. It's been busy in a bad way. Just car in the shop, life stuff. I did find some time for a nice, relaxing game of Gloomhaven. That was pretty much the highlight of my week.
Did you kill the dragon?
It was more like a bunch of douchebag cultists.
I'm just saying that because I assume there's a dragon in Gloomhaven somewhere, but I've never.
There is. We haven't found him yet.
Is it super big and tough and liable to eat you alive?
Well, I don't know. I think our guest can help us with that. Hardy's actually my famous Gloomhaven partner of the past months.
That's true. I am. Hello, everybody. I am the famous partner, and just to make sure that we're following canon, technically it's a wyvern, John, not a dragon.
Is it a wyvern? I see.
Or is that pronounced wyvern? I don't know.
It depends. Is it Ryu or Ryu? I don't know.
I believe it's Ryu.
Yeah, man. So it's good to finally have you on the show, man. Welcome.
Thanks very much. It's really a pleasure to be here.
I love. Go ahead. I was gonna say I love this meeting of the minds because D-Dub is here talking about game mechanics and things, and I'm like, I know a game designer who likes designing games.
Oh dear God, who?
Well, I had to settle for you, man.
Oh, crap.
No, we do like Kevin Urbanski, who designs games. Pixel Metal came on the show, who designs games.
Oh yeah, whatever happened to those guys?
Our co-host Brian Niemeyer is designing his own role-playing game. Our former co-host Brian Niemeyer is designing his own role-playing game. I'm sure we've had a lot of, and when we had that one guy doing the Cyberpunk game who came on. We had a lot of game designers. Jeffro, obviously, we had the designer of Dragon Heresy on. Yeah, a lot of game designers on the show.
Running theme.
Game design is cool, man.
Off and on.
That's how you pull. Show up at the bar, be like, "Hey, I'm a game designer."
It's like
it worked. They are drowning in it.
Fact.
Game designers.
That's right. Fact.
Does that ever work for you? Do you ever, young women are like, hey, I worked on Halo?
No, I was married at the time when I made Halo, so no, definitely not.
There goes the opportunity. Opportunity missed. You'd be like, hey, do you know, you familiar with Master Chief?
No, it's actually funny. When I was working on the Halo games, and really for a large portion of my career, I'd meet parents, because I had kids, and we'd meet at the soccer field and stuff like that. And the parents would be like, "Oh, hi, nice to meet you. What do you do?" And I tell them, "Oh, I work in games, and they'd say, oh, that's interesting. What did you work on? And then I will tell them some of the games that I worked on. And then the next time I see that person, if it's at a PTA meeting or on the soccer field or wherever it would be, they'd come up to me and they'd be like, my kid went crazy when I told him what you worked on, that I met you. And I'm like, yeah, I'm kind of famous, but not with you.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's a sad kind of fame, really.
I think it's pretty cool myself.
So I wanted to ask a question. How long were you with Bungie before Halo? Because if I can get a bit autobiographical for a second, I started buying Bungie games in the early to mid 90s. I bought Halo, the predecessor to Halo, the Marathon series, about Marathon 2, Marathon Infinity. And then, so I was a big Bungie fan when they were working on Halo.
There was a big lag spike for me there. Could you guys hear me through that whole thing? Because I lost you there for a second.
Oh, am I breaking up?
No, Hardy, I didn't hear you at all for the past minute or two. So
yeah, that was weird. Big lag spike. Sorry, guys. You were asking me. You were right in the middle of saying that you're a big Bungie fan before Halo.
Yeah.
Right on, man. So tell me some of the Bungie games. I'm sorry. Hit me with that again. Tell me what you used to play.
I played Marathon 2, Marathon Infinity. I never got into Pathways into Darkness. That was way before I started playing. By the time I did, graphics had improved. And I also was never, it's not that I didn't like the idea of their fantasy real-time strategy game, is that I was so terribly bad at it. My dwarven fire throwers, the guys who threw the little grenades, would without fail wipe out all my troops and themselves.
Yeah, you're not alone. You're not alone. Myth. That was called Myth.
Yeah.
All right. First, I'll answer the question. I joined the team and was with Bungie for probably 2.5 years before Halo. And I joined specifically because Bungie had 2 offices at the time. They had one in Chicago and one in San Jose, and I was living in San Jose. And the team was looking for a lead designer to step in and help them ship a game called Oni.
Yes.
And that was me. They brought me on board, and I started to kind of help shape the team and guide them towards success. So I was with the team for a while shipping Oni, and then we had our very successful E3 show with Halo, and Microsoft was like, we're going to buy you now.
People went nuts for that E3 show. I saw it. I watched that entire show.
Yeah, it was dope. I mean, it was a cool show. It was good. It was strong. And when Microsoft made up their mind that they were going to buy us, they kind of reached down with their mighty hand and scooped up both offices, the one from Chicago and the one in San Jose, and relocated us all to the Pacific Northwest in one mighty swoop. So for the first time ever, all the Bungie'ites who had kind of been all over the place were finally in one office. So, and in the process of that happening, the Halo engine had to be completely reworked, and all of the storyline, everything that the game was originally kind of before we kind of moved over onto console, really had to be reworked to fit onto the Xbox. And it became clear that we really couldn't stay as 2.5 teams anymore. We really had to become one mega team to just get the thing done. And so our little band from San Jose kind of got folded into the Halo project overall.
So let me back up for a sec. I want to talk about Halo, but I also want to talk about Oni.
Right on.
I still have an Oni wallpaper on my computer, just saved, because I love the design of the character. And in fact, I had to, I don't know, it was saved in some weird format that made it really hard to convert, and it's taken me like 10 years of thinking about it every couple of years to convert it. But so that, I mean, I knew about Oni from the beginning, and I never had a chance to play it because by the time I went without a computer for a couple of years there, and so by the time I went back to go get Oni, it was gone. It had vanished.
Mm-hmm.
And I always thought it sounded like a fascinating game, a game like I always wanted to play. And some of the design details they were talking about, how they had actual architects come in and design buildings so that the levels would feel real and not just a long, series of artificial corridors. I thought that was fascinating, and I never understood quite why it disappeared the way it did.
Okay, so here, do you want the whole spiel on this? You want the actual full answer?
Sure, why not? I mean,
because I don't want to monopolize all your time with this, but let me put it this way: Bungie spun up the San Jose studio around a group of talented people that they really set their cap to hire away from Apple, and basically gave them kind of carte blanche to do whatever they wanted. And so for quite a long time, that studio was kind of that the San Jose studio of Bungie was really wandering in the woods with a bunch of talented people who had no idea how to take what they were working on and turn it into a video game. Okay. And so there was a slick animation system. There was a lot of interesting character design. There were a bunch of architecturally correct buildings that they'd hired a few architects away from, kind of I don't know what architecture, I guess, or whatever building industry to make these spaces for them. But they had no idea how to take all those disparate elements and turn it into a game that you could play. And that's why they hired me. And so I came in there and kind of was looking at all those different elements. The real answer about the quote unquote realistic architectural spaces was, I remember sitting down with one of the architects at the time, and I was looking at the space, one of the spaces that he designed, and he's like, well, look here, see, this is the space that I've made. It's a futuristic office building. And he's like, these are the meeting rooms, and you'll see here, these are the restrooms, and this is kind of the common areas, and this is the flow pattern back and forth to the elevators. And I looked at him, are we allowed to swear on GeekGab? Is that a thing? This is a meta question for you two.
We usually try to keep it family friendly.
Right on. Okay. Well, then I looked at him and I said, what the heck are these all for? And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, the bathrooms, what are those for? And he looks at me dead serious and he goes, well, I mean, people get really uncomfortable if they can't reach a restroom, it's not easily accessible. And I said, no, you don't understand. Why is it in your game? I mean, can you run in there and like smash the toilets? Can you take an enemy's head and shove it in there and drown them? And he's looking at them and he goes, well, no, it's just part of the floor plan. And that was the point at which I was like, okay, all this stuff has got to go. This is all got to go. Because we were pushing huge poly counts for elements that had been included in these quote unquote real architectural designs that had nothing to do with the level for gameplay. The thing to remember about levels in games is that they're just set decoration. They're just window dressing. They are not real in any sense. Even big spaces or open world spaces are still very carefully designed to facilitate the gameplay systems in the game. And so the final version of Oni that shipped, we took a lot of those architectural elements, but I had to kind of just cannibalize them to turn them into set dressing for the action components of the gameplay.
Right.
So anyway, that's the long answer to whatever happened to architectural layouts. And you notice that no one since then has ever gone back to that as a concept and tried to fold that into games. And that's because it doesn't really work.
Well, and it not just when you're actually rendering it, does it bog down your engine with a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't need to be rendered.
Right.
But especially at the time, I mean, we were dealing with what? 1 terabyte hard drives, or 1 gigabyte hard drives at the max. I mean, the computer I bought at around that same period of time had I think a 1.5 gigabyte hard drive, and I increased it to 3, and that was like a big deal for me. And so when you're trying to store all the vertex information and all of the texture information for a huge piece of architecture that you don't need 95% of it, that's just a waste of resources.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's exactly what we had. I mean, we had beautiful atriums and really fancy door spaces and meeting rooms and all this other kind of stuff that literally was just a giant waste of resources to create these architecturally correct buildings. And to be frank, one of the architects, when we got in there and I started to say, okay, well, we're going to have to rip this out and move this around, put this here and there, he really kind of fell on his sword at that point and went to the kind of higher ups at Bungie and said, look, it's either him or me. And at that point, given that the project had been wandering in the desert for a couple of years and had never actually created a game, they said, well, sorry, partner, but it's going to be him. And so he left the company, and I believe he moved to Australia, but I'm not certain. He went far, far away.
Or did he move or was he exiled?
I can't say.
No, that's too bad. I mean, he put his heart and soul into it, and it took you to tell him, look, man, what you're doing is really cool, but it's not a game.
Exactly, and that's the thing, is that games and game development, it's constantly a learning process. If you ever meet someone who goes, oh, yeah, I have all the answers, they're full of it. I mean, that's really not true. You constantly, just the evolving technology, the evolution of the art form itself, and the interactive medium, you have to constantly keep an open mind to, okay, maybe this worked in the past, but what's new, what's different, what's changing, and how do I have to do things differently? That's part of the challenge of it. And unfortunately for him, he wanted to make sort of futuristic, architecturally correct buildings and wasn't that interested in learning how to actually build game spaces. And that's where he fell off the train. And that's, that happens.
That's too bad.
So you get Oni stitched together into something that's playable and shippable. And people are all excited. If I remember correctly, and you have to forgive me if I misremember this, they have a new publisher at the time that was created with a coalition of companies. They called it Gathering of Developers. Do I have that? Am I remembering that correctly? This was 20 years ago, right?
So what happened was we were working with I think it was DICE, actually, was the company, the publisher on Oni. And the whole sequence of events was kind of full dirty laundry exposure here. The tech people on Myth 2, I believe it was, made a massive mistake. And they actually, in the uninstall feature, they legendarily kind of put the thing in that would go back and erase everything on your root drive when they shipped the game. So Bungie sunk a lot of money into starting the studio in San Jose. Then they lost a lot of money on a huge recall of product on Myth 2. So they had to recall the product and reissue all the product and things like that. And this game had kind of been wandering in the woods or the desert, I guess is the way I said it before, for quite a long time. They had hired these talented people and sort of said, make whatever you want. And they were using their talents, but not necessarily stitching it together into a game. So Bungie needed external funding. They had to get another source to kind of stay in business. And they turned to Take-Two, which was Take-Two was the publisher. And I know I said DICE before, but it was Take-Two. And so Take-Two was like, okay, great. We'll keep you in business. And you'll ship Bungie for us. Well, then we had our massive successful show of Halo at E3. And when that happened, the bosses at Bungie kind of went back to Take-Two and said, look, they want to buy us. And Take-Two said, look, we've been counting on Bungie to be our, big partner to help us with the games you're going to release, blah, blah, blah. Tell you what, we'll let you go. We won't block the sale, because they'd already bought a vested interest in the company. They didn't have to let us go. But they said, we will let you go if you give us all the IP that includes Oni and Myth and all the rest of that type of stuff, everything but Halo. And I think Marathon. I don't know if Jason Jones kind of forced them to let him keep the rights to Marathon or not. I'm honestly not certain. But anyway, give them basically all the IP that Bungie owned, and the other stipulation was we had to ship Oni in time for them to hit their quarterly profits. They're like, look, the game is supposed to come out. You can't miss it. You can't slip it. Otherwise, we're going to block the sale to Microsoft, which basically left our team in this really tough spot of ship or die was kind of the thing. People were selling their houses in Chicago and moving to the Pacific Northwest while we were working away in San Jose. And so it just became a question of how do we get a game finished and get it out the door, of a quality level where we're proud of it. It matches the quality that the publisher is expecting, and they're not going to give us a lot of static about, the game that goes out the door. So, and it was the thing is, if we'd had, I don't know, a whole lot more time to kind of, as the game come together and just polish it and give it more love and make it more feature rich and really work on the art and stuff like that, we probably could have started to try to live up to the hype that had been built up for the game, kind of in the years when it was under development and Bungie fans were really anticipating it. As it is, what we shipped was a very good game. It was very playable, and it was really based on, kind of solid fundamental mechanics. This is just my opinion, but I think this will bear up. It was very playable. It was very fun. What it wasn't was all the stuff that had been hyped up to that point. It wasn't realistic spaces, and it wasn't a cinematic experience that, whatever, all this other kind of stuff that Bungie had spent the time hyping. It was a very playable game. It was a solid action game. It integrated shooting and fighting in a really good way. The story held together. It kind of made sense. Our protagonist was cool, but it wasn't what the hype had been up to that point. And if circumstances had been different and we shipped the first one and it was a success, and then we kind of went back and tried to gather up some of the hype elements and really make them into the second edition of the game or second version, maybe we could have lived up to some of the hype that Bungie had already kind of put out there in the world. But as it was a solid action game that was underwhelming in some ways. The art, people would look at the art and they'd be like, well, why are these environments so simple? Well, it was because they started out life as beautifully rendered architectural environments, and I had to strip them down and turn them into set dressing. Anyway, blah blah blah. I mean, I don't make any excuses. I absolutely stand by the product.
Oh no,
I think we had a lag spike.
Yeah, we had another lag hiccup, but still, that sounds. That's an interesting bit of history there.
Anticipating that it was going to be, and circumstances forced us to make a lot of hard choices about getting it out the door. Okay, I'll stop blathering about that now. Blah blah.
I think your internet gave up. They're like, oh my god, they're. Yeah. No, seriously, that was really cool. You said something in there that really that sticks in my mind and or my craw. You used the phrase cinematic experience. And we talk a lot about this. We talk about tabletop role playing as well. And Hardy and I have very different tastes, but you do strike me as more of a level designer and more of a game designer. So what do you feel about cinematic experiences? Are they part of games you like to design or what?
Well, so my approach to that, from a meta perspective, as far as game design, is that story is you can't think of story or cinematic experiences as that is not interactive. Okay, a story is.
This is normal for the GeekGab.
Not recently. We've been doing really good recently.
Yeah. I feel bad because now he's got to say all this stuff over again.
Dude, this sucks. Got a great show, got a fascinating guest, talking about some cool stuff, and the internet craps out on us because of course it does.
That's too bad.
What the hell, internet? I mean, but is there a problem? You thought that there was too much interesting content on you? There wasn't enough boring stuff, and so the internet just decided to say, hey, that's it. We have passed the quota for interesting and cool stuff today. Everything here on out is going to be boring, and if you insist on creating something interesting, we're going to shut it down. What's the deal?
Wait, what? I'm sorry, you lost me.
Well, your audio cut out after you said the word story, so we pretty much missed the second half of that.
Oh, okay, I see. All right, well, I'll keep it short because I don't know why the audio crapped out on you. But all I was saying was that don't think about it as story. Think about it as dramatic context. If you want to tell somebody a story, you don't get to make any choices as you're hearing about what's happening in the story. But if you set dramatic context, then it adds a sense of excitement and immersion, and then the person can make choices. So, for example, if I tell you how you escape from a burning building, you can hear the story. But if I tell you you're inside a burning building, you can't reach, you can't run down the escape stairwells, and the doors are blocked. The only way out is the windows. What do? Then you have a context, and you could start making choices about, all right, how are you going to get through the window? If you're going to smash it, blah, blah, blah. So story is it's a dead end concept. Think of it as dramatic context instead. And so
here's something else. Here's a different idea. People play games because they have goals, right? The goal in Monopoly is to drive everybody else into bankruptcy. There are different goals for games that people largely set for themselves or that they accept in the context of playing the game. And dramatic events dealing with characters and situations and things going on around the player that they don't have direct control over. What they do is, in addition to whatever goals the player has set, they add goals, they add impetus, they add a drive so that the player is more invested in playing through a section of the game. Story, quote unquote story, all it is making your game more interesting by giving the player goals in addition to whatever they want, whatever they're doing, whatever they choose to have goals. And you have to kind of sell that subtly, but that's all that story is. Getting players to invest more emotionally in the outcome or success of a game by giving them reasons to care more about what's going on in the game other than just the mere goals they set through playing, get through a level quicker, get through a level without dying, get through a level with only using your fists. Other than those kind of goals, you give them something else to invest in.
Are you asking me if I agree with that, or?
No, that's just a thought I had.
That reminds me of this. Actually translates to tabletop games too. Hardy and I go back and forth a lot about story and let's call it dramatic context in our tabletop games and role playing games. One of the big complaints I have about modern Dungeons and Dragons, for example, especially with all the actual play videos like the shows like Critical Role and things, a lot of people get the wrong impression that it is about telling a story. You really have to turn their minds around and use the perspective that you use the game to tell a story, not the other way around. The story is told by the gameplay, not a game that makes a story, if that makes sense.
Well, so to go back to the previous point, and as a segue into what you're saying, John, like when Jason's saying it gives you an additional goal, I think it's important to sort of start from the perspective that people play games to have fun. And then you approach a game and say, okay, I want to have fun. The game then kind of posits a bunch of rules that put challenges that are set up in front of you. So acquiring story can be one of the challenges, right? Or putting everybody out of business in Monopoly can be one of the challenges, or building your airline in Airlines Europe so that it's the most powerful and most widespread airline. Those are all different goals. So when you're approaching the game, you have to kind of decide for yourself, yeah, those goals are interesting to me. Those seem fun. And that's why I like Gloomhaven and I hate Scythe, is that the goal of cooperating with my friends to overcome a bunch of monsters and uncover a little bit more story and grow the power of my characters is interesting. But I want to do it cooperatively. The idea for me, the goal of sitting around and beating my friends by creating a more, efficient economic engine and then thereby squeezing them off the map isn't really interesting at all. The cooperative aspect is what holds interest for me. So you start by assuming, okay, the player wants to have fun. Now we're going to set up a bunch of constraints around that, kind of challenges for them to try to overcome. Some of it could be story. Some of it could just be pure mechanics. Whatever that is, it's always important to start with that. Like, all right, what does the player want to do to have fun? So then it goes to your question about role playing or tabletop RPGs. Some people do want to have those kind of, that cinematic experience. They want to play the dramatic context. They want to be Luke Skywalker who's confronting Darth Vader. Some people just want to play against the tough tactical, rules of how much gold can I carry and, how many supplies do I have and can I actually survive to make money, in a dungeon by removing the dungeon, regardless of dramatic context. It doesn't matter what the story is. The story is I'm gonna get paid when I survive this, nightmarish excursion into the Underdark. And so you got to be clear about the goals, like how you want to have fun up front. And they're both valid. They're all valid. It's just interesting how people's tastes differ.
That's true. And that I had another odd thought during that, because you made me realize that when you accept that as your premise, when you go out to make a game and you ask, how do I make this game fun? You have an audience in mind. You may not explicitly have an audience in mind, but you know the type of person that you're making this for. When you sit down to make a Halo or a Gloomhaven, you know the type of person that that is going to want to sit down and play this game.
Absolutely. And for me, we started to have a conversation in the green room before we went on air. There was some question about kind of my design philosophy. My approach very often when it comes to game design questions or game balance questions is I like to put my 14-year-old kid hat on my head. Now, I ain't 14. I haven't been 14 for a very long time. But I try to put a kind of let me imagine that I'm a player and I'm going to experience whatever it is that's going to go into the game as a player. Let me, just imagine that I'm experiencing a set of constraints or a set of game mechanics or even a bit of story or something like that. Let me try to experience that and see how I feel about it from that kind of place where I'm impatient. I'm only looking for things that are, very satisfying to me or interesting to me or engaging. And my friend Scott Rogers is a longtime game designer who one of his sort of principles is, you build a game and then you spend time removing everything that isn't fun and then you ship it. And that's an interesting way to approach it. It's that same idea of what is the consumer going to hate? What are they not going to like? And absolutely putting yourself in the mindset of, well, what is my audience? What do they hate and what do they like? And how do I satisfy that is a huge challenge. And that's, I think, a big part of being successful.
I've been looking at this last week, a history of EVE Online. And you drill down into what happened and how it happened in OSEC and all the way the various factions interacted. When you first look at it at a really superficial level, it looks like this grand scope, this grand sweep of like the pseudo history. But if you actually drill down just a tiny bit deeper, you realize that everything that happens in nullsec that people have heard about, that massive battle with that lost $300,000 worth of stuff, whatever, that it is all driven by game mechanics, but also the physical constraints of the hardware and the network and things like that. And it's really fascinating how it's just barely underneath the surface that the setup of the game is what drives how those alliances function, and that if you added some other features to the game, all of that would change dramatically.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the most fascinating things about multiplayer communities and games, and massively multiplayer games, even more so, kind of to the nth degree. My experience with that happened when I used to play Dark Age of Camelot a long time ago, kind of an old school MMO. And it had three different competing kingdoms. There was a Celtic kingdom, a kind of an Arthurian Britain kingdom, and then a Viking kingdom. And you could go to one of those kingdoms, level up your character, and then when you hit level 50, you would then go and fight against the other kingdoms in open warfare in these, kind of grand, massive battles, which were, if you were to look at them now, they were just terrible. I mean, the art was so ghetto, and the game mechanics and the control mechanics were just awful. But what I found the most fascinating about that game was that the way that they combined mechanics changed the culture quite a bit from realm to realm. In the Viking realm, for example, there was one class called the healer, and the healers had AoE, what they call spread heals. So they had these massive heals that could heal, everybody at once for a whole lot of damage. They had single target heals that could bring you back from the dead and kind of restore you into combat. So they had two specs, basically. They had two ways that they could kind of create their skills. So they had the sort of the big healing and buffs and stuff or not buffs, but big heals and they could remove poison and status effects and things like that. Or they could go crowd control. So they had these incredibly powerful spells that they could cast that would stop the entire enemy army in their tracks and force them to pause for a couple of seconds. Well, because that one class had life or death power over all the Vikings and trolls and kobolds, when the healer arrived on the battlefield, they just started to issue orders, and all the monsters and Vikings and berserkers and and trolls and kobolds, you just fall in line and do whatever the healer said. You didn't ask any dumb questions like, why do I have to do what you say? Because they held the power of your life in their hand on the battlefield. But what was interesting is that in the Arthurian kingdom, everybody had a little bit of their own self-healing. Everybody had their own self-buffs and could kind of break status effects on their own because they were trying to recreate that idea of, you get to be a fantasy, like you can be Friar Tuck, or you could be Sir Lancelot, or you could be Morgan Le Fay. And so everybody had enough to be kind of strong on their own. It wasn't that the whole, kind of all the power for healing or crowd control wasn't consolidated in the hands of one class. And so organizing the Knights of Camelot for war was incredibly difficult. Like I would go and, I'd walk out onto the level 50 battlefield, with the people from Camelot. Nobody was listening. Everybody was running around like, follow me, let's go over this hill, let's do this, that, and the other. As opposed to the Vikings, man, when the healer walked on the battlefield, it started issuing orders. You just did what they said. Like, you got it. And the only difference really was the fact that it was how the game mechanics were organized. And I found that so fascinating.
That's incredible.
It was really cool.
It's one of the things that I personally like as because I'm a software developer by profession. I don't do games, but when I'm designing systems, I appreciate a well-designed system is something that generates the behavior and the effects that you want, without forcing it, without orders or anything like that. Just you start with a state, and when you add people to it, what happens? What do they do? And that is one of the most interesting things about any system, not just MMOs. I find that absolutely fascinating.
It absolutely, I agree. It is fascinating, and it's interesting to also see, going back to Jason's original point about EVE Online, the fact that when one of these cultures kind of rises up around a product or a piece of software, and then stabilizes, you start to see how
Oh, there we go. Good.
ways they start to rely on it, they start to interact with it, they start to kind of work around the limitations in different ways, almost regardless of what you're doing as a developer. You can try to get in front of that a little bit and shape the behavior, but sometimes the cultures will just do what they're going to do, and it almost doesn't. I mean, you almost can't control it because it's a little bit of like a runaway train. And one example that I would point to is the red versus blue, machinima videos that those guys used to make, kind of making fun of Halo multiplayer. They didn't really have any good tools for doing that. And yet they still, because they were kind of really committed to the idea, they were really committed to the culture, they found ways of creating the stories that they wanted to create, even within the limitations of the software itself. So EVE Online is a really, I don't know, it's very interesting that it's an MMO that has grown up and it still persists to this day, and the people are still out there playing when so many other MMOs that probably had, I don't know, arguably a bigger budget or whatever, have kind of come and gone. So it's interesting to see the ones that that come alive and stay around, even if they're not necessarily the next new hotness or the biggest possible thing that's out there. You definitely have something special there.
I want to talk about Eve for just a second, then we can jump into Halo. One of the interesting things that happens around 2005, 2006 in Eve is that the original culture of the game, which is very much heavily based around role playing, or based around people getting into these fictional roles of playing, pilots and miners and dictators and stuff, to where they were doing a bunch of things that were suboptimal as far as gathering money and gathering materials and manufacturing things and moving up to bigger ships. So in terms of the actual game mechanics, they were deliberately going against it because they had this other goal of role playing. And then when Goonswarm comes in and Band of Brothers gets destroyed, you see this big, huge shift from people role-playing about being individuals in this universe to people playing to defeat their enemies in very cutthroat manner, and learning and developing all of these tools of spies and betrayal and sneak attacks and all of that. That is really, really fascinating, because the entire culture of the game over the course of less than a year gets completely swapped out. And at the same time, and the reason why it happens is a lot of the old powers that grew powerful under the old culture got wiped out. And so that's when you had the brand new era of Eve. And it's just interesting that they pretty much wholesale replaced the culture and replaced a lot of prominent players during that time.
There's a really interesting set of kind of sociological discussions that I follow right now that are going on in the intellectual dark web about the idea of collective intelligences. The idea that a group can rise up and, through the tools of the internet, through chat rooms and through a bunch of different shared systems, for example, the tools inside of Eve, form a collective intelligence that then can act in the real world in some kind of meaningful way. The Eve people they started out acting in game, but for sure the real world spying ops and all the rest of that type of stuff is an example of, in my opinion, a collective intelligence that kind of has spread from online into the real world space. And you see that with the QAnon people and a lot of the kind of stuff that's happening online is these collective intelligences form around ideas that are important. And people, they not only do they kind of circle the concept itself, but they evolve. They when they're kind of put under pressure, or they're attacked, or they're challenged, or whatever, the nature of the culture and the tools that they have evolve as well. And so I would make the case that that's what you're seeing with Eve, and the culture in Eve, is you're kind of seeing the rise of these CIs, these collective intelligences of players, who are becoming more aware of, oh, I have these different tools, and real world spying and all the rest of that type of stuff, whatever they're doing. And it's carried out in so many different corners on the internet. It's really interesting.
And I'm just going to say again, there's one last thing. CCP, the developers of EVE Online, they really pushed the emergence of factions and the emergence of alliances and then coalitions, because they kept on introducing new ship types that were larger and more powerful, that if you're going to engage in war, you have to have them. But they were so expensive in terms of not money, but actually physically gathering minerals and bringing them back and refining them and producing components that go into making up the ship. The introduction of capital ships drove the emergence of alliances, because you had to have more players working together to produce these ships, and that dynamic increased even more so with the introduction of Titans, because that was just a monumental task. And so they themselves drove the emergence of alliances and mega alliances in the game, because they introduced, simply with the introduction of new ship types. Very fascinating.
Yeah, well, I remember attending a GDC one year, an interesting GDC talk, and they were talking about the title of the talk, and this is funny because it sort of predated the ubiquitous rise of the business model, but it was about the free-to-play business model. And I think the title of the talk was essentially like, free to play, what are you, crazy? Like, why are you giving it away for free? And what those developers were explaining at the time, and again, the market has proven how powerful this particular business model is. But what they were basically saying was that no matter once you have a successful game, if you have a successful game, you've got players who are what they call whales, and you've probably heard this term before.
Yeah,
people who are willing to invest just unbelievable time and resources in the game. And it was really interesting to me. They had a panel of these people who'd put these free-to-play game models up there. And the moderator said, okay, well, for those of you in the audience who don't believe that the free-to-play model can be effective, I'm just going to do a little kind of non-scientific poll. And he said, for all of you developers with the free-to-play business model, how many of you have players who spend $10 a month on your game? And they all raised their hand. And then he said, how about $20 a month? They all raised their hand. He said, let's make it a little more interesting. $50 a month. They all raised their hands. How about $100? They all raised their hand. He said, how many of you have $500 a month or more? They all raised their hand. So it was like, yeah. And so I guess my point is that when you have one of these successful models and it forms a kind of a living culture, the capacity for kind of player investment is just staggeringly vast. It's just amazing how much time and energy and effort people will put in once they, I mean, if it's pushing their buttons, if it's really satisfying for them, it's just staggering how much time and energy they'll put in to these, to these things. And it's also, take that same parallel and put that into collective intelligences that are formed around other things, political things or economic things or whatever. And it gives you an idea. I mean, at least for me, it's kind of the sobering idea that, like, no matter what area you're interested in these days, if all you're going to do is dabble, there are going to be people out there who just will work you under the table no matter what it is you're interested in. So anyway, but yeah, it's interesting stuff. Absolutely fascinating.
It's kind of amazing. I think we saw what you're calling collective intelligence is. I think we saw them, one or two of them, realize that they could actually affect important things in the real world, which is also a really fascinating thing.
Mm-hmm.
I would argue, one of those things was Gamergate, which is a sort of a really weird thing. I think Daddy Warpig could probably tell us a lot more about Gamergate than we all know. But the idea is that people realized that something was happening in the real world. They could collectively do something about it, and not in sort of the cheesy clean up your community sort of action. In the sort of make a small ripple of change in culture.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just people working together, no leaders, no anything like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So as long as we still have the internet, the world is going to continue to get stranger and stranger.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. I hope not. All right, sorry, this is a very metaphysical point, but my thought about this is that what we're seeing right now is, for the first time in human history, we now have a set of tools that enable us to think and react to events in darn near real time. And so I kind of think about the internet as almost like the nervous system for the human experience. It's like, imagine that we're just a newborn kind of entity, and that's humanity as a whole. And pretty much all we can do right now is feel pain and cry. Like, that's kind of all we can do. We can't really react to things all that well. We can experience things, but we haven't really developed the tools yet to to process things in a holistic way or react to things in a holistic way. But in my humble opinion, as a culture and as a species, it's important for us to figure out how to do that. And I don't know, as the internet and as our society, human society, as our species kind of continues to evolve, now that we have this, this sort of digital nervous system connecting us all, I honestly hope that we kind of get past the point at which we realize that we seem different, and we start evolving to a place where we realize that we have a lot of commonality, and we start to develop some tools that are better for communication and focusing more on, kind of, how we react to things as a species more than whatever. But that's my meta point.
Well, that's kind of interesting, and I don't think I necessarily agree with your conclusion or your projection. But let me make sure I understand where you're coming from. If we use an individual as a metaphor, we've got a nervous system, which you did use it as a metaphor. We've got a nervous system where if there's a something wrong with the body, then we'll send a pain signal, and maybe we'll send antibodies and something like that. So we can use that as a metaphor for our internet connected society where, let's say there's a tsunami in the Pacific. Well, we can mobilize resources to help repair the damage and undo that and help those people there. So you can view the world and our society as an organism in metaphor. You think that it's possible that humanity would become an organism in fact? Is that what you're thinking?
No, what I mean is, imagine that the human organism right now is really all it can really do is react kind of like a baby reacts to its environment. So the human organism feels the pain of a tsunami, in the South Pacific. It's localized pain, right? It's only affecting a part of the body, and the baby's ability to react to that is limited to it's very limited. Like, it can't, the baby, let's imagine it's literally just sort of an infant that's laying there. Like, it can feel pain. It can kind of move its legs around, right? It can cry. It can do some stuff to kind of react to pain. And imagine humanity, the species, is this massive, massive organism, but that we only right now have the ability to react to a tsunami or to hunger or homelessness or war or or bigotry or whatever, all the rest of that type of thing, kind of like a baby. But someday, I hope that our species will evolve the tools to be able to really react like a child or even an adult. I mean, and that's the point at which I imagine we will see, just a completely different form of human society, completely different forms of human interaction, because we will understand not just how to act locally, but also globally, and take inputs from people that are, that aren't just local to the situation. I take the situation in Puerto Rico, for example. That's a pain point, right? And there are some people that are experiencing on the giant, whatever, the body of the baby of humanity, but the baby is not doing much about it. Like, it's kind of thrashing a little bit and kicking and crying. And I'm not suggesting that the people in Puerto Rico are babies. You understand? I'm just trying to draw out the metaphor. That the body itself is not doing anything. But if humanity had its adult capabilities, it could deal with pain. It could deal with those things in just a really profoundly powerful way. Imagine all of our species, all of humanity, able to identify and categorize and prioritize pain points and deal with them. Like, what couldn't we do if the entire species became this, kind of, we were actualized as this massive kind of collective entity? And again, I'm not talking about we're all a hive mind. I'm just saying, if we get to the point at which this digital nervous system that we've built enables us to react in a way that is not just localized, but instead is really kind of out across the entire organism. I mean, the universe itself is not beyond our grasp. That's my crazy science fiction thought for you for today.
Well, I was just about to say, I'm looking forward to you expanding on what you think that would look like in a science fiction novel.
Yeah, I think it would be cool. The thing is, you a little bit earlier, you sort of attributed the idea of collective intelligence. You said, well, that's your term. It's not my term. Remember, this is coming off the intellectual dark web. There's way smarter people than me that are thinking about this and talking about it. I mean, like, so smart that I look like a big old dummy. But I like to listen to what they're talking about and pay as much attention as I can. But yeah, maybe I could write some speculative fiction about that. It might be interesting.
You should do that.
Okay. All right, it's on. It's on, brother. You got it.
Fantastic. We usually stop after an hour, but that's not a hard and fast rule. Do you still want to talk about Halo multiplayer?
Who, me?
Yeah.
Oh, good God, no.
Fantastic. That sounds good.
Why don't we hit the Halo multiplayer thing next time? If that is presuming I'm invited back. I don't know.
Of course, yes. You've done it. You've put us on the spot, on air. Yeah, we'd love to have you back on.
Awesome.
Hey, DW.
Yes, I'm still here, technically breathing.
We didn't really get many questions in the chat. Just a couple people hanging out and saying hi. Do you have anything else you want to ask Hardy, or you want to add?
No, I think we're good. It's a great show. We talked about a lot of interesting things. There's some stuff that I might have wanted to talk about more in depth, but it wasn't really stuff that was central to the discussion or important about it. But yeah, we covered a bunch of interesting stuff. So I'm glad people showed up to listen live. Thank you very much for coming on the show. Very much appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. This was really fun to gab with some geeks about some geeky stuff. I love it.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun as usual. So thanks a lot for coming on, and thanks to the chat for hanging out with us.
Yeah, thanks for the invite, guys, and hopefully we get to do it again.
All right, DW, can you take us out?
Sure. This is GeekGab, folks. We're here about every Saturday about the same time. You can catch us on youtube.com/GeekGab. You can catch this show and all the other myriad of previous shows that we have made for you. Also, you can catch us on, if YouTube is not your thing, or if you're on a portable device, you can catch us on the Google Play Store, on the iTunes Store, and on SoundCloud.com. subscribe to the podcast, download the show to the mobile device of your choice, and you can listen to everything that went on live. Thank everybody who came to the live show and participated in the very, for this show, abbreviated discussion. Kind of surprising today. And we thank, of course, everyone who is listening to this show later. Folks, we, your hosts, are checking out for today, but don't you worry, don't you fret, we will be back.